Welcome to the Cambridge Festival and welcome to this event, which is focusing on a very important question, which is about how climate change will affect our health. This event is being hosted by the Gates Cambridge program. Gates Cambridge is the University of Cambridge's leading scholarship program for international postgraduate researchers who are at the cutting edge of research. We are celebrating our 20th anniversary. I have the privilege of being a trustee of the Gates Cambridge Trust, as well as being based at the Department of Geography here at the University of Cambridge. One of the key aspects of the Gates program is not only recruiting academically outstanding researchers, but placing a really important emphasis on social impact. The subject of today's panel discussion is right at the center of those concerns. As we know, climate change is likely to impact on a whole range of our activities, but particularly ranging from everything from where we live to what we eat, as well as profound implications for our health and well-being. In this panel discussion, we have four speakers. Kim Van Dalen is going to be talking about her research and advocacy for climate change and health. Ritika Subramaniam is going to be talking about her research on climate migration in India and the knock-on effect on women and girls' health. Environmental design consultant and lecturer, Dr. Ankatha Kichua, is going to be speaking about how overheating can be mitigated through architecture and building design. And finally, Ramit Debnath will talk about his research on housing and energy conservation. Just to tell you a little bit about the format of our discussion. Each speaker will be speaking for about 5 minutes on their subject, and then there will be time for a general discussion, which I'll convene and chair. We expect the whole event to last for approximately 45 minutes. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I'm grateful to all our speakers for finding time to take part in this. I'm going to introduce them as they speak. So I can start by inviting Kim Van Dalen, who will be our first speaker. Kim is doing a PhD in environmental epidemiology. She's focusing on environmental metal pollution and risks associated with that on cardiovascular disease.
Okay,
Alongside her PhD, she's part of the Lancet Countdown, where she focuses on climate change and health issues, specifically in Europe. Kim, thank you, and over to you.
So thank you so much, especially to Mandy, for inviting me here today to talk about one of my biggest passions, which is climate change and health. I'm very excited for the upcoming hour and especially
Definitely,
excited to
Dutch.
hear from my colleague scholars as well, who will be presenting after me.
Which you can be
So, like
finished.
you've already
Please
heard,
don't just stop.
in my PhD, I'm focusing on environmental arsenic
That's
pollution
not
and
out.
risk on
It's very
cardiovascular
Dutch.
disease. However, my broader interests are more in climate change, health, environmental pollution, and specifically their interaction with inequities. So, next to my PhD, I also work for the Lancet Countdown, which is an international collaboration of over 120 academics that summarize the interaction between climate change and health every year. And these findings are being published in a medical journal called The Lancet. And these data make clear how climate change is affecting our health, the consequences of delayed action, as well as the health benefits of a robust response. And accompanying these academic reports, we also have several policy briefs that focus on policy in a specific region. So usually we focus on the biggest emitters in the world. So for example, the European Union. And last year I wrote the policy brief for the European Union together with CPME, which has also been presented at the European Parliament. And all of this is happening ahead of the UN climate negotiations in order to provide the scientific evidence that hopefully is able to influence international policy as well. But how is climate change actually impacting human health? Well, although human health has been intimately connected to our weather and climate, our climate is now changing more rapidly and more dramatically than ever. And this means that the environment that provides us with clean air, food, water, shelter, and security is being impacting, as well as that our bodies are being impacted directly. So populations around the world are adversely impacted by things as extreme weather events, air pollution, and heat waves. And we see increases in things as cardiovascular disease, but also respiratory disease and heat-related illnesses. We also see infectious diseases now popping up at regions that they didn't show up before. And it's not just heat or just air pollution what we're worried about. What we're really worried about is this multi-hit scenario whereby climate change in a way correlates previously uncorrelated health risks, meaning that we see a lot of different health impacts at the same time. And with inadequate investment in public health infrastructure, this means that the world will likely not be ready to deal with this impact. However, the vulnerable and marginalized populations are feeling these health harms most acutely. Like COVID 19, climate change reveals deeper questions of justice, whereby climate change is interacting with existing social and economic inequalities and is exacerbating long-standing trends of inequalities within and between countries. So therefore, we often call climate change as a so-called health threat multiplier, whereby it is intensifying challenges of not only health, but also of health determinants, including things as hunger, poverty, and conflict. So the people that are being contributing the least to climate change are being impacted the most. And I specifically wanted to focus a bit on gender equality and climate change and the gendered impacts of climate change on human health, as well as the representation of women in climate policies. So we know that all genders differ in their needs, perception, attitudes, and vulnerability to the effects of climate change. And that although the converse may be true in some places, in many regions, women and girls have increased health risk as a result of climate change compared to boys and men. Traditional gender roles mean that women and their children spend comparatively greater amounts of time in homes than boys and men do, and consequently, they are more likely to be exposed to, for example, indoor particulate matter, which is another word for air pollution, from the use of, for example, traditional indoor stoves for cooking and heating than are male individuals. And inhaling such particles results in increased risk on cardiovascular disease, but also respiratory disease, and has negative impact on a woman's reproductive health. And women have also different nutritional needs compared to men and boys, and are more likely to skip meals in terms of food insecurity because they are lower in the household food hierarchies. Likewise, climate change may also affect women's ability to seek reproductive and maternity health services, and pregnancy related outcomes are influenced by infectious diseases, temperatures, and nutritional statuses. Yet, all too often, women's voices, especially those from marginalized groups and, for example, indigenous populations, are not being heard at climate negotiations, despite that there has been a focus on the Gender Action Plan in international climate negotiations. In the last few COPs, we see that women are being represented as only a very fraction of the total delegates. So in COP24, for example, only 38% of delegates were women and only 27% of head of delegations. And this may result in communities, countries in the world being less prepared for climate change and already vulnerable population being disproportionately bearing the impacts of climate change just because women's unique perspectives and expertise in not being included. Why is all of this so important? Why is it important that we think about public health when we think about climate change policy and vice versa? Well, there are various reasons for that. And one of the reasons is that, well, climate change is already impacting human health. I just showed you a slide at the beginning of all the different health impacts that climate change had. But likewise, climate change mitigation and adaptation also results in significant health co-benefits to cleaner air, healthier diets, and more livable cities. So what I mean with that is that the actions that we undertake to prevent climate change or to adapt to climate change actually have a positive impact on human health. So think, for example, about air pollution. The World Health Organization has estimated that around 7 million people a year die as a result of air pollution. But with climate change mitigation policies, next to reducing global warming, we're also reducing air pollution and therefore reducing the amount of people that die every year as a result of air pollution. And also think about things to improve active transport and thereby reduce the amount of people that use their car to go places. That will improve people's cardiovascular health, reduce people's chance on developing obesity, as well as that their mental health will be improving. But thirdly, a health framing of climate change has shown to increase support for mitigation policies. So instead of climate change being some abstract, far away problem, talking about health makes it something that is personal. Instead of suddenly talking about polar bears, we're now talking about us. And that makes something that increases the support of people for mitigation policies. And fourthly, climate change is exacerbating existing inequalities. However, national efforts continue to fall short on the commitments made in the Paris Agreement. So it's now important that we make sure that we align the global recovery from COVID-19 with our response to climate change. And this can result in a triple win. We can improve public health, create a sustainable economy, and protect the environment at the same time. However, we need to take in mind that the time is short, and failure to tackle these converging crises in tandem would move the 1.5 target out of reach, damaging the health of the world's 7.8 billion citizens in the short and long term. And I wanted to end with saying that although climate change is often cited as being the biggest global health threat of the 21st century, at the same time, climate change action is likewise the biggest health opportunity of the 21st century.
Thank you very much for that, Kim. And I think you've set up our next speaker really brilliantly well. I'm not going to ask you to sort of elaborate or take comments yet. And I think what we'll do is we'll move on swiftly to Ritika, who's our next speaker. Ritika is currently doing a PhD in multidisciplinary gender studies, and she focuses on the intersections between early marriage and climate migration in Western India. Ritika Subramaniam has worked as a journalist and researcher for the last 10 years in India and brings both her sort of experiences from that as well as her current and ongoing PhD research. So, Ritika, over to you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm very honored to be a part of this very inspiring panel. Now, while 2020 will, in every probability, be remembered as the year the COVID 19 pandemic hit, it was also the year in which the effects of the climate crisis continued unabated. The dramatic cyclone Amphan that damaged parts of India and Bangladesh, devastating wildfires in Australia and California, super typhoons in the Philippines and Vietnam, flooding and landslides in Afghanistan, Japan, China, and Pakistan, to name a few. But beyond the data and statistics, it is the experiences of millions of the Earth's inhabitants that tell us the true story. In the global south, these impacts are far more devastating for vulnerable indigenous, tribal, and rural communities, given their historical compulsions as well as the lack of access to resources and opportunities. And the climate crisis, as even Kim indicated, is most certainly not gender neutral. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights Study on Climate Change and Gender revealed that in general, it is the women and girls who bear the brunt of the climate crisis. A clear majority of the world's 1.5 billion people living on $1 a day or less are women and girls, predominantly from the global south, who rely most heavily on those natural resources susceptible to climate change. Now, the unequal access to resources and decision making processes, along with limited mobility, exposes them to the more negative effects of climate change. Their domestic responsibilities become even harder to fulfill, and the nutrition levels, sexual and reproductive health, access to land and resources, and mortality are negatively affected. Recently, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature has also found that increased environment stress and resource scarcity leads to increase in gender-based violence, which includes domestic abuse, sexual assault, rape, forced prostitution, a higher incidence of human trafficking in naturally distressed regions. And an entire generation of child brides, climate brides, is being created globally amidst this burgeoning crisis. Now, drawing on my journalism and ethnographic work back in India, I will take this conversation forward by training the spotlight on this invisible and extremely vulnerable group of climate brides in the global south. Now, let me begin by narrating a story. Mala became a mother 2 years ago. She's 18 years old today. I got married at 15, she said, when I met her in January this year in her house in Beat district in Marathwada. Now, located in western India, Marathwada is a historically drought prone region that is also considered to be the epicenter of India's agrarian crisis. In 2017, the region was experiencing its fifth drought in a row. The near total crop failure, exacerbated by the mounting economic crisis, had driven nearly 4,700 farmers to suicide by then. And over 1 million farmers were turned into cheap, underpaid, and bottom of the heap labor. There are also reports of an alarming rise in early motherhood, forced abortions, maternal mortalities, as well as forced hysterectomies of young women in this region. And the rates of early and child marriages have multiplied manifold. Now, speaking in Marathi, Mala told me that she had begged her parents to wait, but the family had no land of its own. There was no water in the well, the crops had died. Her parents said there was no money to keep her. 2 days after her secret wedding at home, Mala and her husband were already sitting on a truck with 10 other young couples to work and live in the sugarcane farms as migrant cane cutters for the next 6 months. Here, recruitment took place only in pairs as a married couple. Thus, for Mala, marriage became an inevitable step to transition from being a daughter and schoolgoer into becoming a wife and wage laborer to survive the drought and the scarcity. Now, globally, too, a growing body of largely empirical literature, particularly in Asia and Africa, examines the disproportionate impacts of and the potential interlinkages between early marriage, climate change, and natural disasters. Now, in the aftermath of the 2004 tsunami, for instance, minor girls in Indonesia and Sri Lanka were reportedly forced into marriage with tsunami widowers, and in many instances did so to receive state subsidies for marrying and starting a family. In more recent times, the climate crisis in South Sudan compounded the already precarious situation on the ground. In addition to the impact of the civil war, the landlocked African country witnessed long periods of droughts since 2017, which were then followed by catastrophic floods in 2019. The crisis devastated the harvests, creating extreme food shortages. This insecurity forced many families to marry off their girls in exchange for livestock using the bidding process. In some cases, girls were married so that their dowry could be used as a bride price for their brother or father to marry someone else. Now, across the Indian border, between July and August 2010, Pakistan witnessed abnormally heavy floods that killed more than 2,000 people and rendered nearly 14 million people homeless. In its aftermath, NGOs such as Girls Not Brides, Interact Worldwide, and Plan International reported an increased occurrence of child marriage across the 62 affected districts. Now, these are common narratives. What they make clear is that even as robust scientific data is still lacking, qualitative research in the regions affected by frequent and intense ecological disasters are progressively witnessing how climate change intersects with and exacerbates existing structural hierarchies and power inequalities. From increased labor for obtaining water, fuel, and food for their families, and facing new obstacles due to intense droughts and floods, escalations of violence, including sexual abuse and rape, in the wake of disaster, and additional challenges to access assistance and humanitarian aid during disasters, research indicates that marrying off a minor daughter during a climate related disaster can mean there is one less mouth to feed. Finally, feminist responses to the global climate crisis call for fundamental system changes with a focus on a just, inclusive, regenerative, green, and care based economy, and developing a broad based understanding of the gendered vulnerabilities as choreographed around poverty, social discrimination, and sociocultural practices becomes really central to understanding girls' capacities to negotiate the health and well being challenges intensified by climate change. And their meaningful participation and the amplification of their voices is essential as girls will hold knowledge that is key for shaping climate resilience in the near future. It is important for us to investigate and treat the cause, not just the symptom. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Ritika. And I'm going to turn now to our next two speakers who are going to start to tell us a little bit about options and responses that are being discussed in this space. So our next speaker is Dr. Nkatha Gichuya. She's a lecturer in the Department of Architecture and Building Science at the University of Nairobi. In addition, she's a practicing architect as well as being an independent researcher working on both national government and international policy frameworks, but in particular interested in understanding how architecture and building design can help to mitigate some of the issues that both Kim and Ritika have been telling us about. So Nkatha, over to you.
Thank you so much. And I'm truly honored to be part of this conversation on a very interesting topic that has been part of my work for the last 10 years in research. And moving on from the two very interesting topics of discussion, I'd like to speak about climate change related impacts in the built environment. One main direct implication of climate change to health is the increasing case of thermal discomfort in buildings that has led to increasingly high levels of thermal health risks. And with increasing occurrences of record high temperatures, deadly heat waves in the recent years, especially during the summer, and now almost all year round in the tropics, the topic on thermal health risks has become a major concern. And part of my PhD research 4 years ago, I investigated the Indo overheating risk phenomenon in Nairobi, in Kenya's capital, which is in a tropical region. And part of my PhD thesis was researching on the impact of climate change on the indoor overheating phenomenon across time, across 100 years. And also as well investigating the space characteristics of buildings that are of higher risk, and what characteristics of buildings, by how much each of these characteristics contribute to indoor overheating risk over a period of 100 years of Nairobi's climate. And more importantly, what design alternatives there are and or space use actions there are to mitigate this phenomenon across time. And an interesting outcome actually from this work showed that buildings in Nairobi have an 88% chance of being overheated at 3.4 degrees above the World Health Organization thermal threshold. And this is bound to get worse as we get onto the 2080 scenario, 50 years from now, where it's projected that on average, buildings would be overheated 5.4 degrees above the WHO thermal comfort threshold guidelines. As part of my work and what I was trying to investigate through looking through, how do we strategically then respond to indoor overheating risk and ensure that the effectiveness of this type of strategy stand the test of time? Because in architecture, you realize as architects, we do design buildings to last for 100, 200 years, part of over time that we are not in 100% control over. So how do you rationally justify that all these strategies will stand the test of time, especially in a highly heterogeneous urban landscape that keeps changing with time? And that was one of the questions I was trying to ask. And I further developed an overheating risk management decision aid that presented not only a synergy of decision relevant information to deal with indoor overheating risk, but then how this information can be shared out and interpreted across different stakeholders, different decision stakeholders, a stakeholder including a building occupant like ourselves, who just wants to know how to get back to a level of thermal comfort as efficiently as possible, or how to respond to building managers who have to respond to the different spaces of a building with probably different occupant levels of thermal thresholds, or respond as well to design team like architects who want to know across all strategies that have been listed over time, which one is the most important to mitigate indoor overheating risk. And at the same time, moving up the spatial decision-making scale to respond to local authority level decision makers who then have to not only identify different strategies that stand the test of time for individual buildings, but they have to think about the diversity of urban geometry and other urban level parameters, including governance level. And you find that all decision makers, including market innovators, national policy programs, could benefit from a process that facilitates, in a sense, decision appraisal across what do you identify as a key strategy to mitigate indoor overheating risk. And in the case of Nairobi, through my research, we were able to identify quite a number of pathways to mitigate indoor overheating risk across a span of 100 years. Decisions with regards to building regulations, where then it was possible through the framework to identify what items will go to the building code and manage that. Decision tactics across different building typologies, renovation tactics across time, space use conditions, as well as mitigating higher risk factors to indoor overheating risk. Almost like a chessboard where every decision maker reads from one space. Like for instance, in the case of Nairobi, I was able to identify how then we can restructure Nairobi's building code to include legislation that governs climate management to manage indoor overheating risk, as well as identifying what regulations or how then you can advise the local authority on how to manage buildings that are on a 24-hour economy, which operate differently from one that have a normal working day, and many others. And through my research, in 2017 I completed my PhD and came back to Kenya to find out how then to begin to pursue some of the applications of this work, which are still a work in progress. And I've also managed beyond looking how this work could advise policy in especially the built environment, but I've also been trying to expand the scope of the different pathways and outcomes of my PhD to manage key priority areas of challenges in my country, Kenya, because it seems that climate change management, if put across the different priority areas, it takes a backseat, and you find the youth unemployment problem is a major factor considered during policy as an urgent matter, or the aspect of managing increasing poverty levels. And what I managed to do is to see how then to infuse climate change management solutions to these key critical areas, and how better then to devolve this spatially neutral scientific information across not only the urban areas that I studied, but also how then this can also be used to contribute to managing the same risk in the countryside regions, and not only from the formal spaces, but also for informal settlements, which are quite which are a higher percentage of most of the regions we have in Nairobi in particular. And I'm slowly finding that this space of the science, policy, practice space is one to watch out for, especially when you're discussing on how to manage impacts of climate change very effectively. I think I'll stop there and hand it over to you, Bashar, and interesting conversations can continue in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Nkatha. And I'd like to move us on to our final speaker, who is also going to be, I think, engaging with some of the issues that you've been talking about, Nkatha. So our final speaker is Ramit Debnath. Ramit is doing his PhD in energy policy here at Cambridge, and he's also a visiting researcher at the International Energy Agency in France. His research intersects questions of energy justice, of data science, and poverty alleviation. And again, he's going to be talking about some of these issues in the context of our subject around climate change and health. So Ramit, over to you, and thank you for speaking.
Thank you, Bhaskar. Till now, what we have heard is all the intersectional elements that affect climate. For example, the effects on gender, the effects on health, the effects on the built environment. So my research focus on understanding what is the main implication on injustices. So I take the route of distributive injustice that talks about the welfare benefits. And my main study areas are slums. So I have 3 study areas in India, Brazil, and Nigeria, where it's the same case that urbanization forcing people to live in slums, and then these built environment have its more impact on lack of welfare or lack of distributive elements in terms of better health, clean energy access, and health outcomes in as well. So the 3 SDGs that are very important are good health and well-being, gender equality, and the clean energy access. And one problem that is very common with climate change is the heat waves. So as Kata mentioned, that the indoor heating is extremely high, especially in these informal settlements, because their building material is a problem. There are no ventilation strategy.
Today is the first day of my
there is
trial
also
versus Twitch. There's going to be some information posted below if you'd like to. Hey guys, today is the first day of my trial versus Twitch. There's going to be some information posted below if you'd like to dial in and listen to the case, if you're interested in hearing about it. And thanks for watching. Hey guys, today is the first day of
urban planning problem, that the houses are not built in a way to promote cooling. So this creates a very cumulative effect on electricity demand. So rising electricity demand but low income and poverty is a very bad combination. So my way is to find out what are the ways and what are the solutions that can come up from the community itself. So just policy design in this sense integrate or means that how can we combat or fight the climate change impacts, also provide clean energy and well-being in a broader goal that uh, trickles down to a good health outcome and well-being as well. One way of using is using modern technology, using machine learning and artificial intelligence, especially when we have a huge amount of data in terms of deliberations or speech from people. So what I did was go to these communities, talk to the people who live there, especially women who live there, and they kind of have the most interaction with energy services and the built environment in these slums, and have their voices together to kind of understand what is the commonality between injustices in this area, especially when they are forced to pay a huge amount of electricity bills just to cool their home or to gain access to their basic services. So one way was to use these narratives or rich narratives from the ground just as it is, and the other way is to how do we influence this or improve the narrative more objectively into a policy making framework. So that's where the power of natural language processing comes in, and these are two of my recently published papers that we have used, that how can we use natural language processing to kind of inform policy from this ground. And the grounded voice are very important because this gives a very strong sense of character to the problem. For example, in India, a very big problem was the urban design itself of these slums, and also the slum rehabilitation housing, which are the social housing that the government is planning to rehabilitate these people. So the problem was there is no adherence to building laws. So that means there is no daylighting inside, there is no natural ventilation, and since these people cannot afford air conditioning because they are in poverty, so that creates another poverty trap, that I am forced to stay inside my social housing, which is approximately 24 meters square, just like a single room, and I have to bear the burnt of climate because it's extremely hot inside. And earlier in the slums they used to have open spaces, but now in the government built affordable housing there is no open space because they are built in a vertical structure with 10 to 12 story high, and it creates a very shoebox like effect that people are forced to live in shoeboxes. In Brazil it was quite different in this slum rehabilitation case, because there people were forced to move into the slums because they lost employment, and because of that they had to use whatever informal materials they had to create a housing. And that's again problem with the material characteristics, they don't have access to formal electricity, and that's the whole climate change is affecting them because now they are getting flooded over there, and also in summer it's extreme heat and they have to spend most of the time outside. In Nigerian case, for a comparative study, we found that the problem is with the distribution side, because the distribution company, they don't have regular billing periods, and the power quality is very low, so that means it's completely load shedding for 8 hours a day and they are getting billed for 24 hours. So that creates again a very strong economic burden. And also with this load shedding, their appliances are getting damaged a lot, and that's again a problem with mobility because these slum rehabilitation housing are far from the city center. So even a repairing of appliance means you have to leave your whole day wage and go to a repair shop and repair it and come back. So it creates a very strong problem of distribution, right from the distribution company to how people are interacting with the energy and the built environment of this place. So now what I'm doing with the International Energy Agency is using these methods of natural language processing or public deliberations in large scale to inform some of the problems with system integration of renewables. So we know that renewable energy is a solution both for climate and for distributive injustices. But how do we fit in the renewables in, for example, can I just go and put a solar panel on top of a slum? But that's the problem, that how do we integrate it in more systematic way that use a lot of policy tools that already exist, but also go to right from the generation side to the uh, distribution side. So now a new problem that's coming up is, because of high renewable electricity, the power quality is really getting affected, right at a national scale, at a local scale, and even at a very regional scale. So that creates another problem, because this will trickle down to poor distribution setup right at the informality or at the bottom of the pyramid. So this creates a kind of a climate based dialogue, that either we have the solution, but now it comes for how do we fix it, or how do we kind of, how Katha mentioned, that it's like a game of chess, that who moves the all the pieces together and come up with a more sustainable implication. So that's for me, and thank you for inviting me to this amazing panel.
Thank you very much for that as well, Ramnik. We have a few minutes for discussion, and you've already raised some really stimulating issues that I'd like to pick up with you on. I think for the benefit of our audience, I'd find it really helpful if you can reflect a little bit on the circumstances of the last year, in particular, the impacts of COVID on some of the issues that you're studying, but also what we might learn from the experience of responding to COVID, how that might shed some light on some of the issues that you've focused on. I suppose, as a general point, one of the very visible consequences of all forms of crisis is that they unequally impact the most vulnerable members of society. And it's evident from the work that you do and the sensitivities that you've brought to your work that you're very keen to shed some light and amplify the voices of those who are often neglected from processes of decision making, who are often invisible. So I wondered whether you could reflect in particular on this question about either has COVID impacted the dynamics that you're talking about in particular ways? And then secondly, are there things we can learn from in the places that you're working in terms of COVID response that might shed light on this broader question that we're debating today, which is around climate and health, and how could responses to that be designed in more sensitive and appropriate ways that address, in particular, the most vulnerable groups in society? I'm not sure who would like to kick off on a response on that. Ritika, you're in the field at the moment. Maybe I'll draw you in first, and then maybe we can broaden.
Um, at first it actually just started with suggestions, and when it then turned into official public directives, these 3 points of washing your hands, keeping your distance, and staying indoors. These apparently simple, actions that were meant to, stem the threat of the virus were really 3 actions that really changed the course of life for a lot of young girls and women in the region that I'm even here based out of at the moment. I mean, over the past 1 year, and especially during the lockdown period from March, when the lockdown in India was announced overnight, um, thousands and thousands of marriages took place in a further hush hush manner than they did earlier. I mean, because in terms of even child marriages in these areas, right now the expenditures actually came down when it came to organizing and managing these marriages. So it was done at home. It was done in like complete safety of home, and in the absence of any guests, and even guests included, even your officials who could have had some sort of understanding. So in that sense, COVID did exacerbate the number of early marriages and intensify the existing conditions, in the sense that right now it's very difficult to establish a clear causality, but at the same time it was a very very important factor that pushed these marriages. And in addition to marriages, I think another important thing was access to water. I mean, on the one hand, we were talking about staying home and staying safe, but here the only way you could get water was going to tankers, which immediately required a lot of people coming together. So either you could maintain social distancing or you could access water. So these were other challenges that have emerged over the past few months, and we continue to document it. In terms of lessons, yes, I think it is, firstly, it is a big reminder in the sense that, I think both conversations on COVID-19 as well as climate change are taking place, have to take place simultaneously. Because what COVID did was actually bring to the fore what climate change has been doing and will continue to do in terms of its social, economic, and ecological implications. So, in that sense, I think it's been an important reminder. Right now, in terms of just child marriages, which I'm focusing on, and migration, one of the things is the government has actually set up committees whether it's, an immediate response to the COVID-19 pandemic and this whole global conversation. But I think in turn, it is going to really speak to, larger conversations and implications as well.
And Kat, I want to draw you in because one of the things that COVID has done is that it's fundamentally changed the ways in which people live and work. Office buildings that used to be busy and full are lying empty. And I think that obviously has impacts for questions that people in your world must be thinking about the future of the ways in which people will work when we emerge out of the crisis. And that potentially offers both a challenge and maybe an opportunity if the density of occupation is going to change, if there are projections about the ways in which offices are going to be used. So I just wondered, you talked about how sometimes urban planning can be spatially neutral, almost ignoring the kind of diversity of ways in which people work and live. Are there lessons that are being drawn into the questions that you're addressing?
That's a very interesting question, because part of the question we are asking as architects, especially in the tropical regions, and I'm speaking particularly to Nairobi, is especially on the indoor overheating risk management. That used to be a key area of concern in office buildings, in a sense, because it gets hottest between 12 noon to 3 p.m. That's around the same time the entire population is at work, most probably in an office or a commercial space. And most recently, most of the policies on indoor overheating risk were written with offices and commercial buildings in plan. Now comes COVID, and then everybody is working from home. I believe some of us are taking this call at home. And all of a sudden, tables turn. Then we're now looking at residential buildings as potential overheating risk spaces that we need to include in the building code. Whereas residential buildings were never part of the discussions in tropical climates. And that's one of the key items that is coming on as a part of the discussion. The other one is with regards to flushing microbes, and how do you deal with viral management, which has not been in the realm of architecture in the longest time, because when you're looking at health and well-being aspects, what is a key priority is managing indoor thermal comfort, indoor lighting levels, so that you get your task lighting right and you don't get affected, your eyes affected, and the indoor air quality in terms of managing how much nitrous oxide you might be having because of the air conditioning. And now all of a sudden we have to deal with microbes. And that's not part of our curriculum. So in a sense, it's part of seeing how then to diversify our discussions and research to include environmental specialists, epidemiologists as part of the design team, which we're actively pursuing. Those two lines are making us very curious as building specialists. And as well, again, in a sense of now that we're working from home, and most of the offices and work regions are in the urban areas because of the amenities that come with it. With the opening of working from home, then the countryside in East Africa, where we see the countryside being 98% of the land mass and the urban areas being the 5% or so of the land mass, we're finding quite a large number of projects, architectural projects, coming to a table on how to design countryside living, but with office spaces. So that's going to change dynamics of both science, policy, and practice across time. And we are very curious to see how this unravels. Thank you.
Thank you. And Rami, just leading on from that, a lot of the narratives that you've been focusing on are with people who are sort of living in newly designed domestic spaces. The public housing that you described, for example, the shoeboxes, which during a period of pandemic, and if you're sort of in forced lockdown, the lack of open space is not just a concern around your physical health, but also has serious implications for things like mental health and mental well-being. I just wondered whether any of your narratives kind of reveal that particular issue, that being locked in a shoebox for 24 hours because of enforced isolation can be very taxing, not just physically, but also mentally. And I wonder whether there's some evidence of that coming through from your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it has been one of a very big problem even before COVID, because the whole social network is broken when they are moved to this kind of social housing or public housing. So that creates anyway a strong problem in terms of mental well-being. And again, there is a very strong indirect energy connection. It's because these buildings are 10-story high and the lifts don't work because people, there is no energy infrastructure to power the services. So since people who live in 10th floor, they can't come down to first floor every now and then because of lack of such essential services which are often overlooked. And that creates a very big problem in terms of, again, disintegrating the social network. And with COVID, and it became a very big problem in terms of even mental health pandemic, because now people are restricted to, so a family of six now live in a 24-meter square home, and there are heat implications because at the same time there were huge heat waves, especially in Mumbai and in Rio de Janeiro, where are two of my case studies. And those are a huge problem because the quality of the buildings and the design itself don't allow to disintegrate the heat, and people are forced to stay inside. So it has a multiple mental health impact, and especially for children as well. So my study itself has shown that people have doubled their time spent in watching TV or mobile phones, and that has a, again, a huge impact on the cognitive abilities. Student can learn, go to school, and also the questions on reliability of internet. So yeah, it all connects to a very complex web.
Thanks, Ramit. And Kim, finally turning to you on this particular question, uh, your work and your presentation highlighted very clearly that questions around climate change and health links are now beginning at least to be visible. Uh, but I wondered, just this expanding concern around not just physical well-being, but mental well-being. How visible is that in the kinds of debates and discussions that are taking place at higher policy level and international policy making? There's been a lot of conversations about how those who've had access to green spaces have been able to cope with the consequences of lockdown a little bit better. The inequalities that you've all been talking about clearly are manifested in the unequal impacts on people's both physical and mental well-being. I wondered whether you have something to say to that, Kim.
I think that historically the focus on climate change and health has been mostly on physical health, and that there is an increasing recognition of mental well-being as well, but it is still something that is very limited, being researched and being tracked and also implemented in policy. There was a recent policy brief which has been produced by the Barcelona Institute for Global Health that is introducing mental health as an important factor to consider when we talk about the climate change impact. Because of course we know that climate change is especially impacting young children because they are afraid of what's going to happen with their future. And that is something that at this moment in our policy is not coming forward at all. But I did want to come back a bit on one of the earlier questions that you posed to Ritika as well about what lessons we can learn from COVID-19 for climate change policy. Because I think that what is really important, what we have seen this year, is that COVID-19 has really been a reminder of this intimate relationship between people and the planet. And we have seen, for example, that climate change can also increase the likelihood of COVID-19 type pandemics in the future, for example, through changes in habitat of different disease vectors, but as well as increased interspecies contact resulting from deforestation. And what we have seen in the COVID-19 crisis is that people will even support very difficult policies if decision making is transparent, evidence based, and inclusive, and has a clear aim of protecting their health and their families and their livelihoods. And I think that this is one of the lessons that we should learn when we're talking about climate change policies as well, because by talking about health and by talking about something that is personal to people, that is about their families, about themselves, it is about their livelihoods, it may be more likely that policymakers see it as something that is not just this abstract, far away problem that is affecting polar bears but not humans, and really start to undertake the action and really realize that we need to adopt science-based zero strategy approaches, and that we need to account better for current and future health risks, and that we need to redesign cities for better lives, that we need to adapt better to the heat impacts, like was already explained. So I think that that is one of the most important lessons that we have learned last year. and something that I just wanted to re-emphasize, I guess.
Thank you, Kim. In conclusion, one of the questions that I would like you to leave the audience with really relates to how the interconnections that you've demonstrated so well in your talks, as well as in the research that you're doing. What's very clear is that there is a very profound interrelationship between all these issues, and policymakers need to be aware that they need to move outside of compartmentalized decision making and really think about these problems and solutions in a much more integrated way. But that is very challenging. One of the commitments that you've all made as current Gates scholars and as Gates alumni is to do your best to make the world a better place. How do you persuade policymakers? What is your strategy? Give me 30 seconds about what you think would be the most persuasive way to convince policymakers to think about these issues with the breadth that's needed, which is so evident from the work that you're doing. Kim, I'll ask you first because you were the first speaker, and I'll just go in the sequence that you spoke.
Sure. I think it really depends on the policymaker, to completely honest, because I think we need to recognize that policymakers may not be able to process all the information relevant to policies that they are responsible for, that they may be very busy, that they may not be specialists in all areas. So therefore, it is up to us to really ensure that we understand how the political system works, that we understand what needs to change, that we understand who has the power to achieve the change, that we understand how to achieve those changes, and that we use all that information to design, frame, and time the presentation of the evidence to policymakers in a way that makes it more likely for them to accept that evidence. So what I have mostly been using is really trying to understand what makes a policymaker tick. So if I see from a specific policymaker that he or she has a particular interest in economic factors, then I will frame my measures around the economic implication of climate change. Whereas as the person has more an interest in health, I will frame it around the health implications. And in that way, I think you can have a very successful way in talking with policymakers and making them commit to the mitigation and adaptation policies that we will need.
Thank you. Ritika, you're next.
I think one of the key aspects is from the kind of work that I'm doing and what I could gather from today's discussion was that, in my opinion, it's very important to think local and to engage with local stakeholders in the sense that with local institutions and local structures, because one of the key drivers of climate change, which connects, is the absence and lack of access to structural infrastructures, which in a way can actually help us cope better, in the sense that, ensuring, which when COVID crisis revealed, like ensuring having better schooling facilities, for example, ensuring nutritious meals, for example, which can be provided by the state and which must be provided by the state, are certain aspects which will help in coping with the crisis and engaging better. And finally, I think, in the whole discourse around climate change and gender, we do look largely at women and girls as victims. There's this whole lens of marginalization, but at the same time, some of the biggest climate change activism and movements have been led by women and girls globally, and even by indigenous communities. So I think it is very important to listen to local voices, local creativities, while shaping these global discourses and global policies. Thank you.
Thanks. And Nkata, over to you.
Thank you. Interesting question, because for the last 3 years, I've been engaged in a space of trying to see how best to present scientifically understood principles in both practice and in policy. And I'm constantly finding that the science policy practice space needs a little bit of more nuanced education or a subject that's developed particularly to it, because I currently made a decision to exist both as a scientist, as a policymaker, as a part-time public servant, to just understand the space better, and still exist as an architect, and just try to see how best to devolve the information I developed for my PhD. And what I'm constantly finding is the three exist in different, they have different domains to them. So science is in the domain of information generation. We have a lot of scientific information on climate change and the problems that would arise if we do not mitigate it. But in the policy space, the main domain is to frame and guide action, where you find that, and I'm constantly finding that science is just one aspect of policy. So you find yourself either mobilizing acceptability of scientific information, politics and counting scientific information as votes to have buy-in, or also align scientific information to beneficiaries' interests and goals and values, and a very structured way to present scientific information that aligns to different governance structures and institutional structures. And away from just science and policy, practice is another different domain where you find most of us architects, and I'm speaking as a practitioner, we use policy just to define boundaries of regulations. And we use science as that one of reference. So constantly straddling through the three spaces, I think we need to recalibrate this space in a way that works. And I'll share with you one thing that I've been doing that might work across getting scientific information out to architects and out to local authority, is I find that architects, to be able to accept and adopt the information I'm developing, is they want to know what to capitalize on. From all the 100 strategies that are out there as scientific strategies, how do you frame what they capitalize on? What is the most effective? And therefore giving them a sense of exploration, giving practitioners a sense of exploration of scientific data is what I think sells in terms of practice. But in policy, what I find constantly selling is integrating that diversity in the urban geometry aspects, in other urban level parameters, but most importantly, aligning scientific information to resource mobilization and aligning it to various governance structures. So those are the two ones that I think are working, but I'll keep updating you as we go on in this very complex space. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Venkata. Yeah. And Ramit, obviously you're actively doing similar things. You're currently working alongside the IEA. In your final slide, I think you showed an important policy report that you've obviously contributed to. So you're trying to navigate this complex space as well. So just some final thoughts from you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I completely agree with all the speakers that definitely one thing that I find very useful is contextualizing policy. So it is very specific, it needs to be, and the second part is also science communication. So that's something that we need to, as a active researcher and someone who is at the forefront of research, we need to do that. We need to make it easy to, how do we communicate? We need to make it more sensible to people who don't understand the difficult granularity. So, and also I would like to add that role of technology is also very important in all of these. So for example, in my cases, a huge amount of technological intervention can be done through citizen science, where citizens are the main voice. And there are lots of ways to do that, especially now when there is WhatsApp, Facebook, and public data available a lot of in avenues. So I think technology, science communication, and contextualization are the three main bold points that I will make in this towards the conclusion of today's session.
Thank you very much, and I'm really sorry to have to draw the dialogue to an end, because we could speak for a lot longer. I just want to firstly thank you for the work that you're all doing, which is extremely important in an area of great significance, but also for taking the time to share your thoughts with our audience. I'd encourage you to carry on these conversations. And I particularly want to emphasize the importance that you've all placed on communication. This event itself is one example, but also the real importance for scientists to get out there, to share their findings, to engage, which is core to the principles that have guided the Gates scholarships. And it's a real pleasure to have been able to share some of this time with you. So good luck with what you're doing, and thank you for your time.